Ancient Egypt is perceived by everyone as something exotic, but in our life, one way or another, the state left its mark. Greece, Rome, and the Middle East were also largely inspired by its achievements, which even then were already considered wild, many thousand-year-old antiquity. Today, we will talk about life after death, about the soul, and about how to deceive God, about the Egyptian Book of the Dead. How and when did it appear? What does it represent, and how did it influence the worldview and everyday life of neighboring peoples right up to us today? You will learn all this in the next couple of minutes. In essence, the Book of the Dead is both a religious scripture and not. Briefly, Egyptians believed that after death, a person needed to go through a whole labyrinth of trials and judgment before the gods, and the Book of the Dead was a kind of guide. What, where, and how to do there so as not to get lost and not accidentally end up in hell. For general understanding, this definition is enough. But since we are here to go deeper into the topic, then let's go deeper. To begin with, let us clarify that the Book of the Dead is a European name. In the original, it is the Book of Coming Forth by Day. Let us recall that the Egyptians built for the dead in tombs a full exit, with signs and with the understanding that the book was intended for the dead. That's the point. Many assume that the Book of the Dead is an analogue of prayers and songs for funerals and for the repose of the deceased. However, in this case, the book had to be read by the dead himself, while alive in fact, and then, already there, apply this knowledge. But just in case, copies of the book were given to him on his last journey. In addition to these instructions, the manuscripts also contain descriptions of rituals and funerals, as well as information about how in general the afterlife was arranged. What is extremely important to note is that the Book of the Dead does not have a single version, and all copies that archaeologists have found in one way or another have at least small differences, and sometimes completely radical ones. In addition to the book, there were also other funerary texts, which are also sometimes included in the composition of this book. And the book itself is not exactly a coherent work. In its maximum, it contains about 200 chapters, often not connected to each other, and therefore surely at some point these were separate songs, prayers and legends which were simply written all together on papyrus or a sarcophagus. A large number of Sumerian legends were once combined into the Akkadian epic of Gilgamesh. The Greeks mixed several Egyptian myths into the legend of Osiris. And finally, scattered Semitic myths were joined into the Bible. In the same way, modern historians agreed to conditionally consider the Book of the Dead a single work for convenience, although in fact we have versions both of the Old Kingdom and of the Ptolemaic era, a difference for a second of more than 2,000 years. From all this one can make such a conclusion. The Book of the Dead is not a book in the sense familiar to us, but rather a tradition or even a template for funerary texts. For each individual person, the book was compiled individually, based on the needs of his life experience, profession, and class. And here we have come to the question of the origin of the book, and it becomes very interesting. Usually, when talking about ancient Egypt, it is about its most studied periods, the Ptolemies or the New Kingdom. Indeed, the main copies belong to these periods. However, the key word here is main. The oldest copy of the Book of the Dead dates back to the Old Kingdom. It was found on the walls of the pyramid of Pharaoh Unas of the 5th dynasty, and that is about the 24th century BC. And that is already a full text, which means there are all reasons to believe that there were even earlier copies, simply not preserved to our days. Here, of course, one can say that this is not the Book of the Dead, but something like its ancestor, and technically you will be right. There really is a completely different idea of the afterlife, and the writing is intended specifically for the pharaoh and not for anyone else. In the text, the pharaoh is presented with instructions on how to get to heaven to other gods and become one of them. From this, they often conclude that the Book of the Dead then was exclusively a royal privilege. Although this is not certain, perhaps there were versions for other classes too, they just also did not reach us. One way or another, starting from the 20th century BC, we find spells of the book in the coffins of various nobles, and not only pharaohs. Again, these copies can quite be considered predecessors of the Book of the Dead, but the general motif of the book, the spells and rituals, coincide. And therefore, both the pyramid texts and the coffin texts historians often conditionally refer to the Book of the Dead, simply calling it an older edition. By the way, the coffin texts are already much more similar to the familiar Book of the Dead. Here, the underworld of Osiris, his judgment and prayers intended to help the deceased in this journey are already described. Around the 16th to 15th centuries BC, there arises already directly the Book of the Dead in that very form familiar to us, and at the same time, it became public property. It began to be found in the tombs of all social classes. Even the poorest received at at least some budget version of mummification. And it is also known that even those who did not have money to take a copy of the book with them, and even those who could not read, tried at least to hear the instructions during life, or even to memorize them. This, by the way, was one of the main parts of preparation during life for the journey after death, to save up for the book. Pharaohs, priests and nobles, of course, did not have to save. But ordinary people treated this very seriously. After all, no one wanted to get lost in the kingdom of the dead. In addition, they also took care, if possible, of arranging their own tomb, sarcophagus, mummification, as well as in general the accumulation of wealth. The more was accumulated, the more could be taken with you after death. During mummification, according to that very legend of death, the internal organs were removed except for the heart. It would still be needed. The body was also made up, placed with the head to the west, precisely there from the side of the Sahara and where the sun sets is located the kingdom of the dead. Into the tomb, besides the Book of the Dead, they tried to place, as far as possible, everything that might help in the afterlife. Clothing, talismans with amulets, cosmetics, food, money, and even figurines of servants if the deceased had them in life. For at least a year, food and other offerings were also brought to the dead. After all, in their worldview, the dead had not died but had moved to the kingdom of Osiris, which means they also needed something to eat. Now let us touch on the Egyptian concept of the soul, and it is very complex. It consisted of 9 parts. The first of them, Ka, or in our terms, double. Ka is present not only in humans but in everything. This explains why offerings in temples and tombs remained untouched. It was not the dead who ate the sacrificial bread, but his double ate the double of the bread. The second part, Ba, most often has the form of a bird, and this part is the closest to our concept of the soul. It personifies our spirit, conscience, emotions. It is Ba that leaves our body during sleep and flies around the world. This explains dreams. The third part, Ach, is precisely Ba after death. If Ba completely depends on the mortal body and can leave it during sleep, then Ak is the soul finally leaving the body. In its concept, Ak resembles our ghosts, which can appear to people. The fourth part, Kat. Here there is nothing interesting. It is simply the mortal body that dies in our material world. However, since the body is also part of the soul, they still try to preserve it and even open the mouth of the mummy so that it could breathe after death. The fifth part, Ib, the soul heart. It is this that Osiris will weigh on the scales. Then the sixth, seventh, and eighth parts, Sahu, Sekhem, and Shaut. Sekhem is our power, something like magical energy, and Shaut is the shadow, reflection. Sahu is more interesting. It is the spirit that remains in the tomb together with the body, Kat. Its functions are not quite clear, but symbolically this part is depicted in the form of a flower growing from the cat. Possibly this is the soul of the mummy itself. And finally, the ninth part, the most interesting. This is Ren, or our name. Ren absolutely must be preserved, for if it is destroyed and forgotten, then the person in the kingdom of the dead will get lost and die completely. Just like in the cartoon Coco. And for the Egyptians, this was indeed very important. On many tombs were found appeals to mention the name of the dead. For you, my name is a moment, but for me, eternity. The name Ren was extremely important also during life, because precisely by it, one could pray for someone or curse. Because of this, people could have several names, a true one known only to close ones and another for protection from the evil eye. Specifically, this practice was borrowed by many neighboring peoples, and partly it reached Christianity. The baptismal name is an echo of that tradition. Finally, let's go through the last path of the Egyptian. If mummification went successfully and all 9 parts of the soul were intact, then after leaving the tomb, his soul sits in the solar bark of Ra. Together they descend through the sky into the underworld, Duat in the west. There the deceased must pass many trials with the help of spells from the Book of the Dead. And if he succeeds, he stands before Osiris, Ma'at, Thoth, Anubis, Ammit, and a council of 42 judges. Remarkably, Osiris is usually depicted as a mummy, but in tomb paintings and in the Book of the Dead, he meets the deceased in the festive robes of a pharaoh. Here the person must make a speech, repent of sins, or, on the contrary, declare his innocence. He may try to deceive everyone, and sometimes it might work, but it is better not to do so. If the gods catch the lie, it will be worse. Here, a person can again use certain spells and amulets, something like cheat codes. Then Osiris weighs the heart and the feather of Ma'at on the scales of truth. If the heart is lighter, the person goes to the ideal version of Egypt. the field of reeds, the analogue of paradise. If the heart is heavier, Amit devours the heart, killing all parts of the soul except the soul Ak. This completely immortal part of the soul goes into absolute oblivion until the very end of the universe, until a new cycle of Ma'at begins. Note, the Egyptians had no hell, only paradise or oblivion. The motifs of martyrdom and resurrection of a god, the terrible judgment of the dead, and the protection of the name from evil curses were very much liked by peoples neighboring Egypt. Even the Persian dynasties and the Ptolemies continued to place copies of the Book of the Dead in tombs. And later, these concepts, as some historians suggest, inspired early Christians. Even in the modern Bible of the Copts, direct descendants of the Egyptians, many terms for law, order, soul, paradise, and judgment remained unchanged since those times, and the oldest of them are almost 5,000 years old. So friends, if you enjoyed this journey through ancient Egypt, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more history brought to life.